Good evening, my friends, and welcome back. If your day has felt long or heavy, let this be a soft place to rest. Tonight, we'll share a calm bedtime history story, the quiet life and legacy of Vlad III of Wallachia, the man later remembered as Dracula, not the monster of legend, but a real soul born into a cold century of shifting loyalties, distant wars, and fragile honor. In this relaxing historical storytelling, we won't chase blood or horror. We'll listen instead for softer things, the echo of hooves on mountain roads, the flicker of torchlight on stone, the heartbeat of a man history could not decide to love or to fear. This is a soothing history narration, meant to help you drift, to slow your thoughts, and to find a gentler rhythm beneath the past. Where are you listening from tonight? A quiet room, a small town, a city window with the lights low? Tell me in the comments below. And if these bedtime history stories bring you peace, you can subscribe and return whenever the night feels heavy again. Now, close your eyes. Let your breath deepen. A door opens toward another time, not darker, just quieter. Together, we step softly through it, like candlelight across the centuries. Let the story begin. Night falls gently over the Carpathians. It does not rush, it arrives like a tide of ink spilling slowly between the peaks, filling the valleys one shadow at a time. The air grows thin and blue, the kind that carries the scent of pine resin and cold stone. Somewhere in the forest, a wolf cries, not a warning, not a threat, only the sound of a creature remembering itself beneath the stars. Inside a small wooden room, a candle burns. Its flame bends with every sigh of wind, throwing its light over the uneven grain of the table. On the table lies a map, not the grand parchment of empires, but a humble sheet sketched by a tired hand. Its lines mark places most of the world will never know. Rivers, passes, and villages pressed between greater powers. The wax drips slowly, forming small ridges that catch the flicker of the flame. Here, we begin. In this trembling circle of light, we meet the shadow of a boy who will one day be called many names. Vlad, son of Dracula. Vlad the Impaler, Dracula. But tonight, none of those names matter yet. The child has not learned cruelty or fame. He is simply a boy born into a hard century, in a land that asked too much of its sons. Wallachia, his home, was a thin strip of survival between two giants. To the south, the Ottoman Empire advanced like a tide of banners and prayers. To the west, the Kingdom of Hungary watched with its armored patience. Between them lay a land of forests and rivers, loyal to neither, loyal only to endurance. Here, alliances were not promises, they were pauses. Vlad's father, Vlad II, understood this well. He served as the commander of the mountain passes, the narrow throats through which armies and fate both tried to enter. In those days, power was measured not by peace, but by how long one could stand before being swallowed by something greater. It was said he could smell deceit like smoke and strike faster than mercy allowed. But in the quiet hours, he was a father. He would trace the edge of the map for his sons and speak softly of the world's fragility. This line, he might say, touching a border, is not made of ink, but of men, and men change. His words fell into the boy's mind like small stones sinking into a deep pond. Vlad listened, though he did not yet understand. The candle burns lower. In its light we can almost see him, the young boy, hair dark as the hearth soot, sitting close to the flame while his father writes by its side. He studies the letters, though he cannot yet read them. Beyond the shuttered window, snow begins to fall, soft and soundless, the kind that turns the night into silence itself. There are no monsters here yet, only the hush before a long story begins. In later years, the world would make Vlad into something else, a symbol, a warning, a myth. But before legend, there was hunger and cold. There was the smell of leather boots drying by the fire. There was a mother's low song, in a language that hardly anyone wrote down. He was born into a house where fear was not an intruder, but a teacher. Outside, the wind moves down from the mountains, sliding through bare branches and across the frozen fields. The candle's flame dances, and in its flicker, time bends. You could imagine this same light falling across centuries, illuminating the same land that has never truly slept. We may picture the valley of his birth, the clustered roofs of Sigishora, red tiles dim beneath the snow, chimneys sighing faintly, smoke from cooking fires weaves with the mist, and the sound of a church bell moves through the streets like breath. Somewhere, a cradle rocks. Somewhere, a soldier sharpens his blade. To live in such a place was to grow up between lullabies and iron. Every cradle dream carried an echo of marching boots. Every prayer was whispered between the cracks of fear. In this small house, with one candle and one boy, the history of a continent already hums the tension between empires, the endless turning of power and faith. Vlad's father would soon be called to join the Order of the Dragon, a knightly brotherhood sworn to defend Christendom against the Ottoman advance. The boy would not yet grasp what this meant, but he would see the dragon symbol carved into the family seal and trace it with his fingertip, wondering why its wings looked tired. He will grow to learn that every oath carries a price, that faith and cruelty often share the same table, that a man can serve God and fear him at once. But not tonight. Tonight, there is only the sound of the wind and the faint scratch of a quill on parchment. The candle leans lower, painting its small warmth on the wooden walls. A single drop of wax slides down, cooling like a frozen tear. The world outside waits a fragile kingdom balanced between shadows, and in this flickering light, a child dreams, unknowing that history has already chosen his name. The candle burns on, a thread of gold against the endless dark. The candle burns lower, and the years turn quietly. Outside, winter melts into a pale spring snow retreating into the rivers, earth breathing again beneath thawing soil. Inside the stone hall of Targovishte, a man kneels before a table draped in velvet. Before him stands a sigil, a dragon coiled in gold, mouth open as if mid-breath. This is Vlad II, father of the boy by the fire. He is not yet called the dragon. That name will be given to him tonight. The room smells of wax and iron. Behind him, a few other men wait in silence, nobles and soldiers, chosen for loyalty and faith. They have been summoned to join a brotherhood, a secret bound by faith and politics alike, Societas Draconistarum, the Order of the Dragon. Its purpose, to defend the Christian world against the growing power of the Ottomans to the south. When Vlad rises, he accepts the emblem, a pendant shaped like a dragon devouring its own tail, the eternal circle of vigilance. To his people, it is a mark of honor, but to his enemies, it is something else entirely. In the language of Old Romanian, Drac means dragon. In later centuries, it would mean devil. From this night onward, Vlad II becomes Dracula, the dragon, and his son, born beneath that emblem, will carry the echo of it in his own name, Dracula, son of the dragon. Names, like seeds, grow in directions no one can foresee. What begins as pride may end as burden. What begins as a symbol of faith may become a whisper of fear. We can imagine the boy, small and silent, watching his father from a corner of the hall. The candlelight strikes the dragon's pendant, making it flash like a small star. He does not yet know what it means, only that it gleams when his father moves, and that men bow when they see it. In his young mind, the dragon becomes a thing of beauty, of power, a creature that guards the land from shadow. But history is never kind to symbols. As the decades pass, words twist, meanings shift. The dragon that once stood for defense will come to stand for terror, Faith and fear will wear the same mask. For now, though, we linger in the quiet before that turning. The Order of the Dragon was more than ceremony. It was a pledge woven into bloodlines. Each member swore to stand against the crescent moon of the Ottoman flag, not for conquest, but for survival. They met in candlelit halls, exchanged tokens of gold and iron, and promised that the cross would not be swallowed by the tide of the East. Vlad II took this vow with sincerity, though he was no priest. He was a man of calculation, of necessary promises. To rule Wallachia meant standing between empires like a bridge built over fire, knowing it could collapse at any moment. The oath to the dragon did not free him, it bound him. From that day forward, his loyalty was watched not only by God, but by men. And each decision he made to bow, to fight, to delay would be measured against the weight of that golden emblem. Outside the castle, the world continued its slow rhythm. Farmers planted seed in thawed fields. The Danube ran dark and strong, carrying driftwood and rumor alike. In the forests, soldiers drilled among trees where sunlight hardly reached. No one knew how long peace would last, only that it never lasted long enough. Within the house of Dracula, the young Vlad grew into the sound of his father's name. He heard how men spoke it with fear, with respect, with something caught between both. He saw how a title could fill a room before the man himself even entered. And he began to understand, in that quiet way children do, that names can rule people's hearts as much as armies ever could. Sometimes, his mother would trace the dragon sigil on the table and tell him stories, not of knights or saints, but of the old spirits that lived in the mountains before any cross was carved there. Even dragons, she might whisper, can grow tired of fire. He did not yet know whether she meant courage or warning. At night, the household prayed by the hearth. The candlelight made the carved dragon on the family seal shimmer as if alive. Vlad would watch the flame reflected in its eye and feel a strange pull, as though something old and restless had chosen his family long ago. He would grow to carry that restlessness inside him. Not yet ambition, not yet fury, only the quiet awareness that he was born into a story already half written. Years later, when people would speak his name in fear, they would forget this, that before the Impaler, before the legend, there was simply a boy raised beneath a symbol he did not choose. Perhaps that is how most destinies begin, not with a choice, but with an inheritance. The candle burns low once more. The dragon on the table seems to move with its shadow looping, eternal, and somewhere in the hall, a father's voice carries softly to his son, "Remember the name, my child, not for what others may call it, but for what you must keep alive when I am gone." The boy nods, not understanding. Outside, the river moves like a dark ribbon through the valley, and the emblem of the dragon glows faintly. A promise, a curse, and a destiny waiting to wake. Morning light drifts through the windows of Sigishora, soft, gold, dust-flecked. The cobblestones below are still damp from night rain, and somewhere down the narrow street, a baker opens his shutters, letting out the faint scent of bread. Bells call quietly across the roofs, not with urgency, but with rhythm, as if the whole town wakes in a single slow breath. In an upper room, a boy sits at a long table beside his tutor. A sheet of parchment lies before him, corners curled, edges rough. His quill trembles slightly as he dips it into ink. The tutor, a man with patient eyes, guides his hand. They write not prayers or poetry, but words of trade and treaty, the language of survival, in a country that must forever explain itself to larger powers. Again, the tutor says gently, "Imperium," say it slowly. "Imperium," the boy repeats, his voice small but steady. This is Vlad's childhood, not the wilderness or battlefield people later imagine, but a quiet, disciplined room filled with ink, parchment, and the scratch of learning. He studies Latin and German, the tongues of those who will one day judge him, Old Church Slavonic for the liturgy, Greek for philosophy, and beyond the open window, the sounds of the market carts, animals, voices drift in like reminders that the world outside moves at its own, indifferent pace. Sometimes, between lessons, he watches the candlelight, reflected on his father's seal, the dragon curled in endless vigilance. The tutors do not speak of it. They only bow when Vlad II enters the room, and the air grows heavy, as if even language stands at attention. Court life in Targovishte is not grand, not gilded, but it hums with small, constant motions. Scribes carrying scrolls through dim corridors, servants refilling lamps with oil, guards whispering at the gates, the faint music of someone tuning a lute in the distance. It is a rhythm of duty rather than joy. And yet, in this rhythm, the boy learns what most rulers never do, that silence holds its own kind of power. He listens more than he speaks. He watches faces as others argue how a smile hides hesitation, how a lowered gaze conceals calculation. To be the son of Dracula is to grow up in a house of watching eyes. Outside the palace walls, the town lives a different rhythm. The blacksmith's hammer beats in the courtyard. Horses stamp in the stables, steam rising from their breath into the chill morning air. Chickens scatter at the sound of boots. Somewhere, a woman hums while mending cloth. The smells of hay, metal, and damp earth weave together the scent of a country awake before the sun fully lifts. The boy walks among these things sometimes, escorted by a guard but left mostly to wonder. He is polite, quiet, his hands clasped behind his back. Children of his age chase one another near the well, and though he watches them, he rarely joins. Even then, there is something measured in him, a stillness, born from hearing too many oaths spoken in low voices at night. For Wallachia is a country of oaths. Every border is drawn with one, every alliance sealed by another. The boy hears words like fealty, tribute, crusade before he ever learns what they mean. He listens as his father meets envoys, men from Hungary, from Poland, from the Ottoman court, each promising peace that lasts only until convenience fades. Sometimes, when meetings end, Vlad sneaks into the hall. The maps are still there, stretched over the tables, dotted with wax seals and faint circles of spilled wine. He studies them, tracing mountain lines with his finger, the same way his father once traced them for him. He sees how small Wallachia looks beside the empires it must please and defy. He wonders not in rebellion, but in quiet curiosity, if anyone ever asks what happens to the small lands when the great ones move. As seasons turn, the boy learns to ride. At dawn, the stables smell of straw and leather. His horse, a grey mare with gentle eyes, stamps impatiently as he fumbles with the saddle. The stable master, older than the hills and twice as quiet, helps him mount. "Grip with your knees," the man says. "Balance is everything." Vlad nods, and they move out into the frost-touched field. The rhythm of hooves becomes its own language. It teaches patience, focus, breath. He learns that control is not about force, but about listening, feeling the animal's motion, the earth beneath. Perhaps this is where he first understands power, not as domination, but as stillness in motion. At noon he returns, cheeks red, hands raw from rains. The kitchen smells of lentils and smoke. A servant hands him bread, still warm. For a moment, the future Impaler is simply a boy eating in the quiet after effort, steam rising from the bowl in front of him. When night comes, torches flicker along the palace corridor. His father speaks with generals, his mother prays. The boy sits near the hearth with his brother Radu, carving small figures out of wood soldiers, horses, perhaps even dragons. They do not talk much. Words are scarce in houses where loyalty is measured by silence. And yet, beneath the stillness, affection lives. A hand resting briefly on a shoulder, a look across the room, the kind of love that does not declare itself aloud, but stays like warmth in the wood long after the fire dies. He dreams sometimes of the maps, their lines glowing faintly in the dark. He dreams of standing at the edge of one beyond it, only missed. He is too young to know that his life will be lived walking those borders, never belonging wholly to any side. The candle gutters again. Another day ends. The tutors retire. The corridors dim. The last echo of horses fades beyond the walls. The world narrows to a small pool of light, a boy, his books, his breathing, the hum of history just beyond the door. No one yet calls him by the name that will haunt centuries. Tonight, he is only a son between maps and oaths, learning how to live in the quiet spaces between them. And somewhere beyond the window, the wind moves softly across the Carpathians, carrying with it a faint promise that peace, however brief, still belongs to those who dare to imagine it. The road to captivity did not begin with chains. It began with a treaty, a promise written in careful ink, sealed with gold, and meant to keep peace a little longer. In those years, even peace came at a cost. For Vlad II to hold his throne, he was asked for something dearer than coin, his sons. And so, one winter morning, two boys rode south from Wallachia toward the lands of the Ottomans. They were not prisoners in the way of dungeons and fetters. Their journey was quiet, watched by both hope and resignation. Somewhere behind them, their father stood on the ramparts, hand raised but still, as if even farewell might fracture what remained of his authority. The younger, Radu, looked back until the hills disappeared. Vlad did not. He kept his gaze forward on the pale horizon, on the road curling through frost. To look back was to lose ground. They reached Adrianople after many days, where the winter sun hung low and colorless over the minarets. The Ottoman court was not the grim place Vlad had imagined. It was vast, ordered, alive with motion servants crossing marble courtyards, fountains whispering beside stone gardens, scholars murmuring under arcades lined with carved scripture. Here, captivity did not mean suffering. It meant watching, waiting, learning and knowing one could never leave unless summoned. The brothers were treated as honored hostages, guests who could not go home. They were given tutors, clothing, and horses. They learned the Quran's language, the etiquette of bowing, the precision of a salute. Radu, curious and open-hearted, listened intently. His Turkish improved quickly. He smiled easily. He found kindness in the rhythm of new customs. Vlad remained silent. He learned because he must, but every word he spoke in the Sultan's tongue carried a trace of resistance, like metal under silk. His tutors called him proud. His guards called him stubborn. He simply called it remembering. At dawn, the brothers would ride along the edge of the training field. Soldiers practiced archery, the sound of bowstrings rising and falling like breath. The air smelled of dust and horsehair and oil. Radu would ask questions about tactics, formations, the empire's vast provinces. Vlad rode beside him in silence, watching the horizon where the mountains of home would have been. Sometimes, at night, when the lamps burned low, Radu would speak softly. They are not so different, you know. Their prayers, their hopes. They believe in mercy as we do. Vlad would not answer. His gaze would stay on the small flame between them. He did not hate, not yet, but he carried a quiet refusal to belong. The tutors, sensing this, tried another method, philosophy. They read aloud passages of logic and reason, the works of Aristotle, translated into Arabic, and the newer commentaries of scholars from Bursa and Damascus. They spoke of order, of balance, of how power must follow harmony. Vlad listened. He learned their logic by heart, but held his own counsel. Perhaps he saw in their calm a reflection of what his father lacked, a structure that did not depend on fear. Or perhaps he saw that reason too could be used as a weapon, sharpened not for truth but for control. Time passed. The seasons outside the palace were measured not by freedom, but by the color of the garden trees. Spring brought almond blossoms. Summer burned white and dry. Autumn came with the smell of pomegranates split open in the sunday. Through all of it, Vlad remained apart, disciplined, restrained, unbending. Radu changed. He grew graceful, fluent in the ways of the court. He laughed with other young nobles, joined their prayers, absorbed the cadence of their speech. The courtiers began to call him Radu Selfrumos, Radu the Handsome. He moved like someone who had found a second home. To Vlad, this was a quiet wound. He did not resent his brother's peace, only the ease with which it came. To him, comfort felt like forgetting. Each night, before sleep, he would whisper to himself the names of the rivers of Wallachia, Argesh, Olt, Dambovitsa like prayer beads, so that the sound of his homeland would not fade. He would picture his father's hall, the candlelight on the dragon seal, the weight of the oaths whispered in its glow. Memory became his act of rebellion. There were moments of gentleness, two small, fragile mercies. A servant bringing warm bread before dawn, a sparrow landing on the windowsill during a long study hour, a letter from home, written in Latin, smelling faintly of beeswax. For a while the brothers would read it together. Then, gradually, Radu stopped asking when they would return. Vlad did not stop asking, but he learned not to ask aloud. Once, after a lesson in swordplay, his instructor, a tall man with patient eyes, said to him, "You fight as if every blow is a question you are too proud to speak." Vlad lowered his blade, breathing hard. "Perhaps," he said, "because no one has answered yet." The teacher only nodded, then learned to wait without forgetting. And that became Vlad's way. He waited. He did not forget. Years passed like slow water over stone. The boys became men. They rode beside generals, listened to the Sultan's counsel, learned how vast the world could be when seen not from fear, but from empire. But even vastness has its limits. For every lesson the Ottomans offered, Vlad kept another buried, a truth whispered in his native tongue, that patience could turn to strength, and silence could sharpen into will. He would later say, or perhaps someone imagined him saying, that captivity taught him three things: to mask anger with calm, to wield memory as a blade, and to smile only when it served a purpose. Radu, meanwhile, found belonging. When the time came, he would choose to stay the loyal friend of the Sultan, the brother who saw peace where others saw loss. Two brothers, one room, two mirrors facing different directions. Both learned from the same tutors, breathed the same air, heard the same call to prayer, and yet, what one found in that echo was comfort, while the other found resolve. The candle between them burns low. Its flame trembles, caught between two breaths. It lights one face turned toward acceptance, and another toward resistance. And for a moment, the shadows it casts are the same. The letter came in autumn, folded once, sealed in dark wax, carried on a tired horse through rain and distance. When Vlad broke it open, the ink had already bled slightly from damp air, turning the words soft around their edges. Even before he finished reading, he knew his father, Vlad II Dracula, was dead. So was his elder brother, Mircea, somewhere far away, in the tangled hills of Wallachia. A rebellion had flared Hungarian-backed boyars, rising against the dragon's rule. His father had fled the capital. His brother had fought beside him. Neither survived. It was said they were taken, blinded, buried while still breathing. Vlad folded the letter slowly, the sound of parchment fragile as breath. The chamber was quiet except for the ticking of an oil lamp. Radu read the letter after him, lips moving silently, then placed it back upon the table. Neither spoke for a long time. The silence between them was not cold, only heavy, a silence that knew too much. Vlad had been many things in the Ottoman court: hostage, observer, reluctant student. Now, he was something else, the heir to a country that no longer wanted him, yet could not ignore his name. In that stillness, power came to him not as triumph but as a question. What does a son owe to the past that shaped him and the future that will forget him? The Sultan, seeing opportunity in the chaos of Wallachia, summoned him. The court was bright that morning, banners lifted, silver bowls steaming with incense. Mehmed, not yet the conqueror of Constantinople but already a man of vision, spoke to the young Vlad with careful calm. Your father served us, but faltered. You are his blood, and perhaps his correction. Vlad bowed, though his heart felt colder than courtesy. He was 16, old enough to hold a sword, young enough to still remember hunger. The Sultan's envoys offered soldiers, coin, and a single promise: Wallachia for his obedience. For a boy raised between two empires, obedience had long been his native language. He left Adrianople under the pale light of dawn. Radu watched from the steps of the palace, no anger, no tears, only the quiet ache of two paths dividing. If you return, Radu said softly, remember, not all prisons have walls. Vlad paused, nodded once, and rode away. The journey north was long, past fields of late grain, past the wide Danube where mist clung low and grey. The Ottoman escort rode in silence, disciplined, unreadable. Each evening, fires burned low, and Vlad would stare into them, seeing not flame but reflection. His father's eyes, his brother's laughter, the house that was no longer standing. By the time he reached the Wallachian border, the air smelled of pine and decay. The forests looked the same, yet everything inside him had changed. He crossed quietly, without celebration. Those who met him on the road, peasants, soldiers, old servants, looked at him not with joy, but with measured uncertainty. A boy carrying the weight of a dead name. Still, the Ottomans kept their word. With their support, the rebel leader was driven back, and Vlad was crowned Prince of Wallachia before the year's end. The crown was light, the silence in the hall heavier. The throne of his father waited, carved and cold. He ruled for less than 2 months. But time is not measured in length, only in consequence. The chronicles say he was solemn, cautious, already wary of those who called him ally. He wrote letters by candlelight, not of conquest, but of order of harvest, of walls needing repair, of taxes to be gathered without cruelty. Perhaps he believed he could build something steady from the ruins. But Wallachia was a land too restless for gentleness. To the north, Hungarian lords watched with suspicion. To the south, the Sultan expected obedience. And around him, the same nobles who had buried his father smiled with the careful grace of men waiting for another storm. It came quickly. John Hunyadi, the great Hungarian warlord, crossed the border under the banner of retribution. Vlad's small army scattered before the iron weight of his advance. In the end, there was no battle, only retreat. Vlad fled through forests wet with autumn rain, his horse stumbling on roots, the sound of pursuit never far behind. He crossed into Moldavia at dusk, exhausted, unarmed, and alive. Behind him, his first crown dissolved like frost beneath sunlight. Moldavia received him not as conqueror, but as exile. His uncle, Prince Bogdan II, offered him shelter, a room, a meal, the promise of protection. For a time, Vlad lived there quietly. He rose early, walked the gardens, spoke little. He trained with soldiers when invited, but never spoke of reclaiming anything. Perhaps he was waiting, or perhaps he had learned that even waiting could be a kind of rule. At night, the wind through the Moldavian hills sounded like the Danube at dawn, low, constant, patient. He would stand at the window, hands resting on the sill, feeling the cold seep into his palms. Power, he thought, was like water. You could hold it for a moment, but it always found a way to slip through. Sometimes he dreamed of his father, not the proud ruler, but the man sitting by a candle, tracing lines across a map. In the dream, the candle burned low, the map crumpled beneath his fingers, and when he looked up, the room was empty. He did not wake with fear, only with the hollow calm that follows recognition. Everything that begins must pass through loss before it can become memory. And so his first taste of rule ended not with defeat, not with glory, but with the soft, dissolving quiet of things too brief to last. History would later name him ruthless, but here he was only a boy standing in a borrowed room, watching the dawn wash the hills of a land that was not his. He did not know that his exile would teach him more than his crown ever could. That silence could shape him longer than power ever would. That to lose early is sometimes to learn what cannot be taken again. Somewhere outside, a bell rang for morning prayer. He turned toward the sound, closed his eyes, and breathed in the scent of wet grass. The crown had slipped from his hands, but the will to wait had not. The mountains of Transylvania rise like sleeping giants, slopes thick with fir, their shadows long even in daylight. Somewhere between those ridges, in a fortress of grey stone and steady firelight, Vlad found temporary shelter. The year was around 1453, and the world had just shifted beneath everyone's feet. Far to the south, Constantinople had fallen. The last great bastion of Byzantium had been swallowed by Mehmed's army. Its domes blackened, its crosses lowered, its libraries silent. Across Europe, the shock moved like wind, a tremor, not of earth but of faith. Old empires murmured prayers, kings sent letters wrapped in mourning, and between them all, small borderlands like Wallachia and Transylvania listened, knowing the next wave would come for them. John Hunyadi ruled here, Hungary's great general, commander of crusades and master of alliances. To his enemies, he was a storm. To his allies, a necessary force. To Vlad, he was a paradox, both threat and mentor, a man whose guidance could raise or erase him. Hunyadi had fought the Ottomans for decades, standing like a wall between East and West. Now, with Byzantium gone, he looked to Wallachia as a shield line that must hold. And Vlad, displaced, unsteady, yet bound by blood to that fragile land, became part of his calculation. The fortress smelled of smoke, parchment, and steel. Every corridor echoed with low voices, maps unfolding, quills scratching, fire hissing against damp logs. Men came and went, knights, envoys, priests carrying letters sealed with wax. Outside, snow gathered in quiet layers, the color of ash. Inside, the world reorganized itself with patient precision. Hunyadi was not a cruel man, but he was deliberate. When he met Vlad, he saw not a lost prince, but an instrument waiting for purpose. He asked few questions and spoke in a measured tone. "You know their ways," he said once, referring to the Ottomans. "Their speech, their tactics, their pride, that is knowledge, and knowledge is leverage." Vlad nodded. He had learned long ago that survival begins with listening. He listened now to the council meetings, to the arguments over coin and supply routes, to the fears spoken half aloud when reports came of Ottoman armies crossing the Danube. Every night, when the fortress quieted, he would walk its ramparts. From there, the world looked divided not by light and dark, but by distance, the far plains glinting under frost. the horizon endless and mute. Somewhere beyond that horizon was his home, his people, and the memory of a father whose choices still hung over him like unfinished sentences. He learned to see history as Hunyadi did, not as story, but as strategy. Each kingdom a piece, each truce a pause between moves. And yet, beneath the chessboard calm, he felt the slow pull of something older, the ache of belonging, the question of what it means to guard a land that no longer knows your name. Vlad studied everything. He learned the Hungarian tongue, the movements of armies, the way alliances were written in gestures long before they were signed in ink. He sat beside Hunyadi's captains, listening to stories of fortresses lost and retaken, of faith held against flame. The older men laughed loudly, drank heavily. Vlad did neither. He stored every word, every glance, the way others stored weapons. There were lessons too, in silence. Hunyadi trusted few. Those who stayed close to him learned when to speak and when to let the air carry meaning. Vlad, once a restless boy, became a patient observer. He discovered that sometimes the most dangerous person in a room is the one who listens without needing to be heard. Outside the fortress, the air was sharp enough to taste. Horses snorted in the stables, their breath blooming white in the cold. Villagers came to deliver grain and left with quiet reverence. They spoke of fears that wandered like ghosts through the valleys of Turkish scouts sighted near the rivers, of rumors that the old world was ending. Inside, plans grew like roots beneath the stone. Hunyadi prepared for campaigns, for embassies, for wars that might never come. Vlad watched him draft letters to kings and bishops, every word balanced between plea and command. From him, Vlad learned that power was not always taken by sword. Often, it was written into silence, sealed with patience. Sometimes, Hunyadi would summon him late, when the hall was almost dark. The candles would gutter low, the map table spread with open parchments. "You are young," Hunyadi would say, "but the world will not wait for your youth to end. Learn where to stand between mercy and decision. That is where all rulers fall or endure." Vlad would bow his head. He rarely answered, but each word sank deep, not as comfort, but as warning. In the long hours after those meetings, he would return to his small chamber. There, he lit his own candle, a single flame reflected in the brass of a goblet. On the table lay a map of Wallachia, lines faded from wear. He would trace them with his finger, as his father once had. The mountains, the rivers, the capital, all the fragile places where loyalty could bend, like thin ice. He knew the Sultan had not forgotten him. He knew Hungary's friendship was never free. He understood now that a prince of a small land is never a master, only a mediator, a flicker between torches that both want to claim the same night. And yet, within him, something steadied. Perhaps patience was not weakness after all. Perhaps waiting was its own kind of power, the gathering of breath before the strike. He began to write letters of his own, quietly, not to the Sultan, not to Hunyadi, but to minor lords along the border, small, careful lines of connection. A few remembered his father, a few owed him old debts. He wrote in courteous tones, never naming intention, only goodwill. In the stillness of Transylvania, he began to rebuild himself not as exile, but as observer, not as the boy who fled, but as the man who would one day return, knowing the shape of every threat. Outside, the wind pressed against the shutters, carrying snow. Inside, the candle's flame leaned but did not break. History, for the moment, had stopped moving. It was simply breathing slow, deep, deliberate, like a man learning how to wait without fear. And in that pause, Vlad learned the quiet art of beginnings, that not all power is born from battle, and not every silence is surrender. The summer of 1456 arrived cool and wind-stirred, a season of change disguised as calm. In the valleys below Transylvania, the fields were silver with morning dew, and the smell of hay drifted far on the wind. Somewhere among those hills, a man named Vlad rode again toward Wallachia. He was older now, his silence tempered by patience, his eyes clear as the steel he carried. It had been nearly 8 years since his first crown slipped away. The boy who fled through rain and exile had grown into someone deliberate, balanced, a shadow that thought before it moved. The lessons of captivity, the stillness of Transylvania, the weight of lost family, all had shaped him into something quieter than ambition, but firmer than doubt. The world he returned to was not the same. John Hunyadi, the great general who had once shielded him, was dying. The Hungarians had lost much in their long struggle against the Ottomans, but they still watched the borderlands with hungry caution. In Wallachia, Vladislav II sat the throne that had once been his, loyal to Hungary when it suited him, loyal to the Turks when it did not. Between their shifting allegiances, the land had learned to bend but never to rest. And so, one dawn in early summer, Vlad rode across the border. No banners, no fanfare, only the faint glint of mail beneath a travel-stained cloak. His companions were few, men from Transylvania who owed him loyalty, and others who simply followed the steadiness in his voice. They moved quietly through forests that seemed to recognize him, through villages where people stepped aside without speaking. At night, the camps were simple, a small fire, a circle of silence. Vlad sat apart, cleaning his sword, eyes fixed on the flames as if seeing something far beyond them. The men whispered stories about him, that he could stay awake for days, that he could hear footsteps before they came. None were true, yet none felt entirely false. He carried with him the gravity of someone who had learned to wait longer than fear itself. By midsummer, they reached the outskirts of Targovishte. The city lay still beneath a pale sky, its towers worn, its walls patched and uneven. The people had stopped believing in permanence. They had seen too many flags raised and lowered. Too many lords promised protection only to vanish with the next campaign. When Vlad entered, the gates opened without battle. Perhaps the guards remembered his father's seal, or perhaps they simply felt the inevitability that came with his return. The streets were quiet, dogs barking, doors half shut, women watching from thresholds with wary eyes. Power, he realized, did not always return through force. Sometimes it returned through fatigue, but Vladislav was not gone yet. He had marched north with his army, loyal to Hungary, confident that his throne was secure. When word reached him that Vlad had entered Wallachia, he turned back immediately. 2 men, 2 claims, 2 memories of legitimacy now moved toward each other like slow, heavy clouds about to meet. The chronicles would later speak of battle, but in truth, it was smaller, stranger, almost personal, a duel between men who mirrored each other's lineage and fears. The field lay just outside the city, near a river that caught the morning light like molten glass. The air was cool, with the faint smell of rain. Vlad stood in silence as his soldiers waited behind him. His armor was plain, unadorned. A single black cloak hung from his shoulders, edges damp with dew. Across the field, Vladislav approached taller, broader, wearing the confidence of long command. For a brief moment, they looked like reflections, 2 branches of the same tree, grown apart and twisted by different winds. No one knows exactly how it happened. Some say they fought in single combat, steel meeting steel until the older man fell. Others say an arrow struck, quick and final. Some whisper that Vlad himself delivered the blow and then turned away without triumph. History does not remember the manner, only the result that by noon, Vladislav lay dead, and the throne of Wallachia once again belonged to the son of Dracula. The wind changed. It carried the smell of wet grass and iron, and something fainter, the weight of destiny finding its shape. Vlad did not celebrate. He simply walked to the river, knelt, and washed his hands in the cold water. The ripples spread outward, breaking the reflection of the sky. Around him, the world was very quiet, not in mourning, not in victory, but in acknowledgement. The long waiting had ended. The next waiting would begin. When he returned to the city, the people watched from windows and corners. Some bowed, some turned away, none cheered. He did not demand it. He moved through the streets with calm steps, as though reclaiming something that had been misplaced rather than stolen. That night, he slept in the palace his father had once ruled. The air smelled of dust and faint rosewater. The tapestries were faded. The candles burned low. He walked the corridors slowly, touching the stone walls, remembering where he had once stood as a boy. Nothing felt large anymore. Everything was measured, deliberate. He paused at the great hall, the same hall where his father had taken oaths, where the old dragon emblem still hung above the throne. Its colors were dulled by years, but its shape remained. Vlad stood beneath it for a long time, saying nothing. A servant entered quietly. "Your Highness," he murmured, "the city waits for word." Vlad turned toward the window, where dawn was beginning again, pale and indifferent. "Then let them rest," he said softly. "Tomorrow will be long." Outside, the first lights spread over the roofs, catching on the silver points of the towers. The war, for now, was over. The boy had returned. The exile had ended. And yet, as the sun climbed, it did not feel like triumph. It felt like standing on the threshold of something vast and unfinished, the calm before a deeper storm. In the hush of that summer morning, Vlad closed his eyes and breathed deeply. The air smelled of rain, of stone, of beginnings that already knew their cost. The throne waited. The silence answered. The first thing Vlad demanded upon his return was silence. Not celebration, not ceremony silence. He wanted to hear the kingdom breathe, to know where it ached and where it lied. The courtiers waited for decrees. The peasants waited for bread. He gave neither, not at first. He simply watched. The land was tired. Years of divided loyalty had made it hollow nobles, changing sides with the wind. Merchants paying twice to survive. Soldiers serving two masters at once. Justice had become a rumor, order, a ghost. And so Vlad began, as all rebuilders do, with control. He traveled in disguise among his own towns. He listened to gossip in taverns, to the confessions of farmers who spoke of theft and taxes in the same breath. He saw a people who feared everything except dishonor. From that fear, he decided, a new Wallachia could be born one bound, not by mercy, but by certainty. His rule was not born from cruelty. It was born from precision. He wrote new laws, brief and clear. Theft, death. Lying, punishment. Laziness, exile. Each decree was simple enough that even a shepherd could remember it. And that was his point. Law should not confuse. It should warn. When he summoned his council, they gathered in a hall where no laughter dared linger. The boyars, old nobles with rings heavy as memory, bowed low. Some had once stood beside his father. Some had betrayed him. Vlad greeted them with the calm of a priest at mass. He spoke softly. His words moved like cold water over stone. "You have seen what happens when loyalty is thin," he said. "You have buried kings and watched crowns traded like coin. From this day, Wallachia will have one face. My law will be that face." That spring, he invited them again, not to council, but to a feast. The day was bright, the tables long, the air rich with the scent of roasted meat and spiced wine. Vlad sat at the head, his cloak black, his hands motionless. Around him, the lords spoke cautiously, raising their cups with practiced grace. When the meal ended, Vlad rose. His voice was quiet, almost kind. "Many among you," he said, "served my father. Some of you helped his enemies. All of you have seen the ruin that follows division. Tonight, that ends." The hall fell still. What followed was not a spectacle of cruelty, as later legends would whisper. It was a purge measured, deliberate, meant to cut rot from the root. Some were taken away, others sent to labor rebuilding the fortress that would bear his name. None left without understanding. In this new reign, deceit would not have time to breathe. To those who remained, he offered no apology, only order. The news spread quickly, first in whispers, then in careful admiration. Travelers spoke of roads where no thief dared wait, of villages where doors no longer needed locks. A merchant could ride from the Carpathians to the Danube carrying gold and arrive with every coin intact. Mothers told their children, "Be honest, and you may sleep safely." Peace, built not on mercy, but on fear that had learned its boundaries. Vlad's moral code reached into every chamber of life. He ordered markets to open at dawn, to close at dusk. He demanded that every coin be weighed fairly, that every oath be witnessed. He forbade idle gossip about the court, and punished false accusation as harshly as crime itself. To his eyes, discipline was not cruelty. It was fairness with the luxury of sleep. "I do not rule to be loved," he once said. "I rule so that no man must lie awake fearing his neighbor." Even so, not all understood. The church called him severe. Foreign envoys wrote home of the Iron Prince, whose calm was more unnerving than rage. Yet among the peasants, a quiet respect grew, the kind that does not show in cheers, but in stillness when his name was spoken. They began to say that Vlad's justice walked faster than rumor, that to speak a falsehood was to summon him, that even the wind paused outside his window, lest it carry secrets too loudly. He did not correct them. Fear, after all, was a tool, and he wielded it carefully, like a craftsman shaping glass. Still, in the quiet hours, he walked the corridors of his palace alone. Servants moved aside like shadows. The torches hissed softly in their sconces. He would pause by the window and look out across the sleeping city roofs, pale under moonlight, the river glinting faintly in its channel. He thought of his father's reign, of how easily power had cracked under the weight of divided hearts. He thought of the faces at the feast, of their eyes wide, not with pain, but with recognition. They had seen in him what they could not be, unshaken. And perhaps that was his true intent, not punishment, but demonstration. To rule a fractured land, he needed to become indivisible. Each decree he wrote, each sentence he signed, was less about vengeance and more about visibility. In a world where betrayal had become habit, he chose to make trust visible by making fear predictable. At dawn, the guards changed watch beneath his balcony. Their armor caught the first light, pale gold over iron. Below, the streets were empty but clean, and from the fields came the slow hum of work beginning again. He closed his eyes and listened. No shouts, no clamor, no cries, only the rhythm of a country returning to itself, cautiously, one heartbeat at a time. History would remember his methods with unease, but also with awe. The chronicles would write of impalements, of terror, but beneath those words lay a simpler truth, that Vlad's Wallachia, for a brief and fragile span, knew order. Not peace, not joy, but order, the kind that lets sleep return, even if dreams do not. And as the morning spread across the land, the prince stood motionless at the window, the light touching his armor like frost. The silence he had demanded had become something larger, It was no longer the silence of fear, but of consequence. By the early 1460s, the air across Europe felt thin, with expectation, like the long stillness before weather turns. Messengers rode through rain and frost, bearing letters sealed with red wax and trembling hope. One of them carried the voice of Pope Pius II, calling for a new crusade. His words, written in fine Latin, crossed borders faster than armies, to reclaim what had fallen, to push back the crescent where the cross once stood. But those who read the letters knew this was not the world of old crusades. Constantinople had been lost. Mehmed's empire breathed outward like a tide that never ebbed. Greece had bent. Serbia had broken. Even the great fortresses along the Danube seemed less like walls than warnings. And yet, far north, between mountain and river, there remained a strip of land, narrow, stubborn, watchful, Wallachia. For years now, it had been Vlad's burden to hold it, not as conqueror, not even as believer, but as something rarer, a boundary. From his palace at Targovishte, he could trace the shape of his fate on a map. The Carpathians rose behind him, cold shoulders of stone. The plains opened south toward the Danube, that long, breathing line between worlds. On one bank stood the forests and villages of his people. On the other, the empire that never stopped moving. He had learned the river's moods, as one learns a creature's breath. At dawn it was pale silver, calm as glass. At dusk it burned like dull iron. Some nights, he could hear it from his chamber, a low, endless murmur, like the sound of time itself dividing one faith from another. Beyond it, Mehmed gathered his strength. The Sultan who had taken Constantinople now looked northward to the passes, the valleys, the small crowns that still dared to glint. He sent envoys demanding tribute, 10,000 ducats, 500 soldiers. Tribute meant survival. Refusal meant war. Vlad read the letters in silence. He had paid once, as his father had, and watched the cost grow heavier each year. Tribute was not peace. It was erosion, a slow surrender written in coin. In Buda, the Hungarian court weighed its own fears. John Hunyadi was gone, but his son, Matthias Corvinus, now sat in his place, young, educated, ambitious. To some, he was Europe's last bulwark against the East. To others, merely another ruler with more ideas than soldiers. Matthias wrote to Vlad often. Their letters were courteous, measured men of duty speaking in the language of necessity. They discussed levies, fortifications, the timing of possible campaigns. Beneath the formality ran something like mutual respect, if not friendship. Both had inherited frontiers, not by choice, but by birth. Both knew how it felt to defend a map rather than expand it. In early spring, when the snows began to thaw along the riverbanks, Vlad rode south to inspect the crossings. He moved without escort, his cloak drawn tight against the wind. The river lay swollen from meltwater, dark and restless. On the far shore, he could see the smoke of Ottoman encampments rising like breath into the cold sky. "Listen," he said to the officer beside him. The man tilted his head. "There," Vlad whispered. "That's the sound of their fires. When they come, it will sound no different, only closer." He watched the horizon a long time. The world there was not made of borders, but of motion, caravans, armies, hunger. Still, he believed the Danube could hold. It was not a wall of stone, but something older, a presence that had seen empires come and go. It reminded him of his own rule, fragile, shifting, but enduring by sheer will. When he returned to the capital, he began preparing quietly. Supplies were counted, towers reinforced, envoys sent to distant courts. His letters to Matthias grew more urgent, but never desperate. "If the river breaks," he wrote once, The plains will not stop them, and if the plains fail, the mountains will burn next. We stand not for glory, but for time. In Buddha, Matthias convened councils, made promises, and hesitated as all rulers must when the cost of honor outweighs the purse of safety. The Pope wrote again, urging action, but his words fell into the usual silence between piety and logistics. Meanwhile, along the southern frontier, the Ottoman presence thickened. Villages near the river began to empty at night. Fishermen no longer cast nets beyond midstream. Traders whispered of new fortresses rising on the opposite bank, of banners stitched with verses in gold thread. For those who lived under Vlad's law, the threat felt distant but constant like thunder beyond the mountains. Yet within the borders, life went on with strange calm. Markets opened at dawn, fields turned green again, and the roads still watched by Vlad's patrols remained safe enough for travel. Fear, contained by order, had become almost a kind of peace. At night, Vlad studied maps by candlelight. The wax pooled slowly beside his hand. The flame bent each time he exhaled. He marked the Danube with a line of ink, darker than the rest, running from the iron gates to the Black Sea. Around it, he wrote names Giurgiu, Bryla, Chilia, places that had learned to live as thresholds. He knew that if the empire crossed that line, no parchment, no promise, no crusade would matter. Still, he did not yield to dread. To him, dread was wasted motion. He believed in preparation, in rhythm, in the discipline of readiness. Each morning, he walked the ramparts. The wind carried scents of river, mud, and pine. From above, the Danube looked eternal, a single vein through which the blood of two worlds flowed side by side. He thought of Matthias in Buda, of the Pope in Rome, of Mehmed in his marble palace, each believing himself the center of a vast design, and he here, the quiet hinge between them, holding a balance that none of them could see. Sometimes he wondered whether any line on a map could truly hold against the breath of empires. Yet he also knew that someone must stand upon it, not in victory, but in witness. That, perhaps, was his calling, not to conquer, not even to save, but to hold, to be the pause between movements, the edge that keeps the shape of the world intact for one more generation. When dusk fell, he would look once more toward the river. The water caught the last of the light, running red and gold before sinking back into shadow. On its far shore, torches flickered small, steady, patient. They were not yet an invasion, not yet, but the wind already carried the smell of iron. It began, as such things often did, with a visit. A small delegation from the Sultan arrived at Targovishte, 6 men on horseback, their robes the color of dust and their turbans wound high and white. They crossed the courtyard with deliberate calm, their steps measured, their eyes watchful. Behind them trailed interpreters and servants, silent as shadows. It was a formal day, clear and windless. The banners of Wallachia hung motionless above the palace gate, and the guards stood with their spears crossed before the stairs. The messengers bowed just enough to acknowledge form, not enough to concede ground. They carried a letter from Mehmed himself, heavy parchment, the seal bright red and unbroken. The Sultan's words were clear. Wallachia was to pay its tribute, and to send hostages as guarantee. Zuchdemands were not new. They were the breath of diplomacy between empires, the rhythm of threat and compliance disguised as conversation. But Vlad had grown weary of such rhythms. He had sent gold before, and seen peace return only as a different shape of pressure. He sat now on the raised chair of state, beneath the carved emblem of his father's dragon. The envoys knelt and offered the letter. It was read aloud, its language heavy with formality and confidence. When the final word fell into silence, the hall waited for Vlad's reply. He looked at them a long moment before speaking. His tone was courteous, almost gentle. "You have traveled far," he said. "Tell your master that Wallachia still stands." The chief envoy inclined his head. "We will carry your words, Lord. But first, as our custom commands, we do not remove our turbans before any ruler save the Sultan himself." It was said quietly, but it hung in the air like frost. In that still room, between two civilizations, even gestures were language, and every omission, a sentence. Vlad's face did not change. He rose slowly, his cloak shifting like a shadow behind him. The hall remained silent except for the faint scrape of armor as guards straightened. "I honor custom," Vlad said at last, "and I understand devotion. If you wear your turbans in respect to your master, then let that respect remain forever." He gave a small nod. The soldiers stepped forward. What followed would be told and retold for centuries, embroidered, exaggerated, darkened. But in that moment, it was not rage that moved him. It was precision, a message as sharp and unbending as iron. The guards approached, not roughly, but without hesitation. Each envoy was held still, and nails thin, square, cold were driven through cloth and into wood. No scream filled the air, only the dull rhythm of hammer and breath. When it was done, the turbans remained perfectly in place, unmoving, eternal. Vlad watched without expression. Then he spoke again, quietly. "Tell your sultan that Wallachia pays tribute to no man who demands worship." The envoys were tended afterward, bandaged, given water, returned alive. He wanted them to live. Death was an ending. This was punctuation. The gesture was not madness, but mathematics, a proof meant to travel farther than his armies ever could. When word reached Constantinople, the court was divided. Some laughed the defiance of a barbarian prince. Others frowned the warning of a man too confident to fear. Mehmed himself, it was said, smiled faintly. "Then he respects custom indeed," he murmured, and began planning. In Wallachia, the story grew quickly, passed from soldier to shepherd. Some told it with pride, some with unease. It became both parable and rumor, that in this land, no symbol bowed, no faith bent twice. But within the palace, after the envoys had gone, the silence returned heavier than before. Vlad sat alone in the council chamber, the faint smell of iron still in the air. The table before him was clean, no sign of the act left behind. Only a single nail remained, gleaming faintly beside the candle. He turned it once between his fingers, studying it as though it were a word written in another language. To rule here, he thought, was to live between languages, between the gesture of the West and the silence of the East, between the sword and the scroll. Every act must mean more than it appears. He placed the nail flat on the table. "It is better," he whispered, "to be misunderstood than to be ignored." Outside, dusk gathered along the river. The guards at the gate shifted uneasily, sensing that something had changed not in policy, but in air, in the weight of what could no longer be undone. In Buda, Matthias Corvinus read the same report days later. His advisors murmured of madness. He said nothing. Only after a long pause did he remark, "A man who nails his message so firmly may not yield easily." The phrase lingered like prophecy. In Rome, the papal scribes entered the incident into their ledgers, under the cold category of diplomatic outrage. But one, an older clerk, paused and added in the margin, "He defends his border by gesture as much as by wall." The act had done its work. No army yet crossed the Danube, but neither did trust ever return. Between Vlad and the Sultan, a silent accord broke the thin thread of ceremony, snapped by the weight of meaning. In the months that followed, the frontier grew sharper. Patrols doubled. Watchtowers lit their fires earlier each night, and the Danube, that breathing line, seemed to hold its breath. Sometimes, when the palace slept, Vlad would walk to the balcony and look south. He could not see the Ottoman shore, but he could feel it, a long, invisible gaze reaching back toward him. Between them, the river lay still, silver under moonlight, unblinking. The world called it arrogance. He called it definition. In an age where kings bent beneath treaties, he had chosen not to bow, not even for form. It was not cruelty that history would remember most from that day, but stillness. A stillness so deliberate, it became language, the quiet sound of a man deciding what he would never kneel to. Winter came early that year. The Danube froze at its edges, turning the boundary between empires into a mirror that no one wished to cross, and yet, in the deep cold of 1461, Vlad did. He had waited months for the right silence. The Ottoman envoys had long since returned, their wounds carrying his message more surely than parchment could. Tribute demands had not ceased, but their tone had changed, less request, more warning. Vlad knew what would follow. Before the river thawed, he meant to strike first. Across the dark water, the Ottoman camps lay scattered along the Bulgarian plain. Smoke rose straight into the colorless sky. Some of those men had crossed into Wallachia before, collecting coin, taking sons. Others had merely waited, soldiers of an empire patient as stone. On a night when the wind stopped and the stars seemed pinned too high for mercy, Vlad's army moved. Torches were kept low, voices lower. Horses' hooves were wrapped in cloth to mute their sound. From a distance, they would have looked like a slow river of shadow flowing southward, a tide running against history itself. When the first village appeared, there was no battle, only motion. Walls were scaled, gates opened, and the silence filled with a kind of orderly fury. By dawn, smoke drifted where roofs had been, and the frozen river glowed red under reflection, not from fire, but from memory. The chronicles would later record it simply: 23,000 dead, over 500 miles of land laid bare. Vlad himself would write these numbers with cold precision, as if counting stones, not lives. But behind those figures was another sound, the quiet exhale of winter air, the crack of frozen earth, the rhythm of men doing what they believed would save their own. In his letter to Matthias Corvinus, written in February of 1462, he described it without apology. "I have broken the peace," he wrote. "I have slain the Turks from Obluchitsa to Rahova, 23,884, not counting those burned in homes or whose heads were taken by my soldiers." He wrote as one might carve words into wood, firm, irreversible. He needed Matthias to understand that this was not madness, but mathematics of survival, that fear, once sent south, might buy time in the north. Yet as the ink dried, somewhere beyond his candlelight, the snow continued to fall. Each flake, each drifting silence, seemed to contradict the arithmetic of the page. For war has its own music, but winter softens it. When torches fade and horses stumble, when the bodies of enemies and allies alike are buried under the same clean white, numbers lose their edge. In that season, the river itself seemed to hold the story. Each night, frost thickened its surface, hiding what had passed beneath. The Danube had seen many things: Romans, crusaders, traders, but never such a deliberate quiet after such deliberate violence. Those who returned from the raids spoke little. Some said they had seen whole towns surrender in silence, too afraid even to speak. Others said they saw stars reflected in blood and could not tell whether they were above or below. Vlad did not hold feasts for them. He gave no speech. He simply received their reports, one by one, his face unreadable. "The river flows clean again," one captain murmured. Vlad only nodded. "Then let it freeze that way." His letter reached Buda in late February, carried by a rider half blind from cold. When Matthias read it, his court fell into uneasy silence. Some praised the courage, Others recoiled at the arithmetic. The Pope himself would later bless Vlad's campaign as holy work. But holiness, like winter, can cover too much. Back in Wallachia, the land slept under snow. No sound of plough or market reached the palace. The fields lay smooth, waiting for spring to show what remained alive. Vlad spent the evenings alone, walking the ramparts, his breath turning briefly to mist before vanishing. The stars above the Danube seemed fixed, cold and unblinking. On certain nights, he imagined the soldiers across the river doing the same, men staring north, each believing his god had sanctioned his cause. Between them, the ice cracked softly, as if whispering that belief itself was fragile. He thought often of the letter he had sent. It would travel farther than he could across desks, through languages, into memory. Its words would outlive the men they described. And yet, even as he wrote them, he must have known no number, however precise, can measure what war erases. The chroniclers would later debate his motives, his morality, his soul. But standing beside the river that winter, the truth was simpler. Vlad was not reaching for conquest. He was buying time, one more season for his land to breathe before the empire's tide returned. At dawn, the frost turned the river to glass once more. Torches burned out along the bank, leaving faint trails of smoke that rose, thinned, and disappeared. Somewhere, on the far side, a single watchfire still burned, small, steady, distant like a star, refusing to die. And for a brief moment, before the wind rose again, the world between them, Ottoman and Wallachian, victor and victim, number and name, stood perfectly still. The air before battle has its own kind of silence. Not peace, not calm, but a space between breaths, as if even the night is waiting to see what men will do. On the evening of June 17th, 1462, the hills above Targovishte held that silence. The Ottoman camp spread below like a living constellation. Thousands of tents, pale in the moonlight, torches flickering between them like restless stars. In the distance, the murmur of soldiers, the clink of metal, the faint laughter of men who did not yet know they would die before dawn. Vlad watched from a ridge, unmoving. He had studied the camp for days, the paths between tents, the position of the Sultan's pavilion, the rhythm of their changing guards. His scouts had mapped the enemy's sleep. Now, as the air thickened with dew, he turned to his captains. "We strike not to win," he said quietly, "but to remind them that we are not ghosts." He divided his force in two, one to circle north, one south. He would lead the center himself, the narrow wedge that aimed straight for Mehmed's tent. There were no drums, no banners, only a thin, steady line of men breathing through cloth to muffle their sound. The moon slipped behind clouds as they moved. The grass, heavy with moisture, brushed their boots and whispered no protest. Even the horses seemed to understand, stepping carefully, snorting softly through flared nostrils. Then, at the signal, a single lifted hand, the night broke open. They came like a shadow uncoiling, torches flaring, arrows cutting through tents, steel flashing in torchlight. Confusion rose like smoke. The Ottomans shouted, their orders colliding in a dozen tongues. Fire caught canvas, then men, then air. For an hour the dark was alive with motion, a chaos so fierce it became rhythm. From afar it might have sounded like thunder rolling down the valley. Yet within it there was pattern, precision. Vlad's men struck, withdrew, returned again, always toward the center, always toward the tent, marked by a single golden crescent. He reached it. The flap was torn open, the guards slain where they stood. Inside, silken shadow. A man sat upright, startled not the Sultan, but a vizier, blinking against light and fear. Vlad froze, then turned, already knowing he had chosen the wrong tent. Outside, the air was thick with smoke and heat. He could hear the clash of blades, the shouts of men calling names they would never answer again. Around him, the world swayed between brilliance and darkness, fire here, moonlight there, each flicker revealing and erasing faces in the same breath. He gave the order to withdraw, not retreat, withdrawal, as deliberate as the strike had been. His voice carried, low and even, through the chaos, back through the smoke. North Road, no sound. The men obeyed. They vanished into the haze, as though the night itself were reclaiming them. By dawn, the plain was littered with the remains of a dream that had burned too bright. 15,000 Ottomans lay dead. 5,000 Wallachians would not return. But numbers, again, cannot hold what breath and silence can. When morning came, the mist rolled low over the field. The smell of smoke mixed with the sweetness of crushed grass. The Sultan walked among the wreckage, his boots darkened by dew and ash. Around him, silence, the stunned, almost reverent quiet that follows survival. He found the bodies of his men, and beyond them, the stakes that lined the road. Old work, not new, remnants of Vlad's earlier warnings. They stood like trees of iron, each bearing the same message in a language no one needed to translate. Mehmed looked and said, "A man who has done this is worth much." Then he turned back toward the river. That night, the stars seemed dimmer. The air along the Danube hung heavy with the echo of something that could not be repeated. For all his calculation, Vlad had known it too, that the night attack was not a triumph, but a moment borrowed from despair. Back in the mountains, he counted his survivors. No songs were sung. They sat around low fires, eating in silence, eyes unfocused, hands trembling without reason. When asked what victory meant, one soldier only said, "We came back." In his tent, Vlad unrolled the map again. The ink from months before the line of the Danube had blurred slightly, as if the river itself had shifted. He traced it with his finger, slow, careful, as though touch could hold it steady. He thought of the Sultan's tent, of the flicker of gold, of the moment his blade had stopped in air. What is history made of? He wondered. Success, or the silence after failure? He extinguished the candle. Outside, the mountain wind sighed through pine branches, cool and endless. The horses stamped softly in the dark, restless but alive. And down in the valley, the fields of Targovishta slept again, blackened, quiet, covered in thin morning light. The world had turned once more. Nothing had changed, and everything had. When the Ottoman army reached Targovisht, the sun was already high. The city stood quiet before them, its gates open, its streets empty. No soldiers waited, no archers on the walls, no smoke rising from hearths, only wind, moving through alleys that smelled faintly of ash and pine. At first, they thought it a trap. The Sultan ordered his vanguard to advance slowly, shields raised, eyes searching the corners of still houses. A dog barked once and fell silent. Far off, a shutter banged against stone. The sound echoed longer than it should have. They entered cautiously, the iron of their armor whispering with each step. Every window was vacant, every door ajar. There were signs of life bowls on tables, cloth left mid-fold, a child's toy by a stair, but no people. It was as though the city had been emptied by breath, its inhabitants dissolved into air. Then, beyond the last street, they found what the wind had been circling around. A field, flat, wide, shimmering in the heat, and across it wood, thousands of stakes, standing upright, uneven in height and color. At a distance, it looked like a dead forest reborn from the soil. The men halted, Even the horses grew restless. They moved closer, slowly. What they saw then was enough to still the entire army. The forest was made of bodies, old, new, armored, naked, raised upon sharpened stakes that creaked softly in the wind. Birds circled high above, their cries thin as wire. It was said that there were 20,000. No one counted. The smell reached them before understanding did. Then silence took over. In that moment, the Ottomans, so vast, so sure of their power, saw not cruelty, but a message. Each stake, each figure, was a word carved into the land itself. Together, they formed a single sentence: turn back. The Sultan sat motionless upon his horse, eyes fixed on the horizon. Around him, his officers waited for orders, but none came. He simply breathed, long and slow. Then, finally, he said, almost to himself, "A man who has done this is worth much." He turned away. Behind him, the army withdrew, uneasy, leaving the city untouched. The banners shifted once in the wind, then stilled. The Danube was near, but the will to cross it again seemed to fade in every man's heart. They left behind only Radu, the younger brother, now a man loyal to the Sultan and his retinue. Radu entered the city as if stepping into a grave made of air. He would rule in his brother's place, gentle in tone, careful in politics, beloved by the conquerors. But Targovishte never quite woke. Its streets stayed too wide, too quiet. Even in sunlight, dust moved like breath over stone. Where Vlad had walked, there were only footprints filled with rain. Where his court had once gathered, the air still held the faint echo of armor, being set down, the sound of authority fading into emptiness. The palace remained. Inside, rooms stood open to the light. Drapes hung unmoving, a chair overturned near the hearth. In the audience hall, a single candle had burned to its base and hardened there, a column of wax frozen in time. Wind moved through the corridors like a thought unfinished. At dusk, shadows fell across the empty throne, stretching long and uncertain toward the door. Outside, the stakes stood dark against the horizon, their message already fading into legend. For days, the birds continued to circle, then left. The air began to clear, the fields turned green again, and in time, only the memory of what had been there remained, a whisper among traders, a warning among soldiers, a story that no one wanted to repeat too loudly. And in that way, the silence of Targovishte became the last act of Vlad's defiance, not in battle, not in word, but in absence. He was gone. Some said he fled north. Others claimed he was taken, or killed, or watching from the mountains. History could not agree, but the land did not care. It remembered him in its own language, the language of wind and stillness and walls left standing, with no one to guard them. At night, the moonlight washed through the open gates, silvering the stones. The city slept without breathing, and if someone, wandering years later, had stood there at the edge of that abandoned street, listening, they might have heard it. The faint sound of banners moving where there were no banners, the murmur of a name still circling through air too quiet to hold it. Not legend, not ghost, just the echo of a man who once refused to bow, and the silence that followed him long after he was gone. The years that followed were quiet, or perhaps simply dulled by distance. After the clash and smoke of the Danube, Vlad was taken north, not as a conqueror, but as a prisoner. In Buda, under the watch of Matthias Corvinus, he lived behind stone walls that were neither cruel nor kind, just cold, like reason itself. His chains were not heavy, they were made of waiting. Historians would later debate how long he was confined, and why. Some say Matthias betrayed him for politics. others that he sought to save him from harsher hands. In truth, both may be true. Empires often use the same gestures for mercy and control. In those years, the noise of battle faded. The iron taste of war left his mouth. He learned the slow routine of a man, unneeded mornings that stretched, afternoons measured by the sound of bells. Sometimes, when light passed through the narrow window, dust moved in it like memory trying to form again. He prayed, or pretended to. He read what was allowed: Latin texts, psalms, the stories of kings who fell and rose. The monks spoke softly to him, never cruelly. One of them said, "All men are servants in the end, some to God, some to time." Vlad had no answer for that. When word of his conversion reached others, it traveled in two shapes. To some, it meant repentance. To others, calculation. But perhaps it was neither. Perhaps it was simply a man trying to rest inside the shape of his own silence. It was there, among the corridors of that half-life, that he met Ilona Szilágyi, cousin to the king, known for her calm rather than her beauty. She visited the cells as part of the court's charity, bringing bread, fruit, letters written for forgotten soldiers. She did not fear him, though she knew who he was. They spoke first through politeness, then through pauses. He would ask about the weather, and she would answer, as if weather itself were a mercy. Slowly, words grew longer, and silences shorter. When she smiled, it was never with pity. In time, permission was given. He was released to marry her quietly, without ceremony. They lived in a modest house near the Pest River, a small garden out back, fig trees and herbs that turned silver in morning frost. Vlad tended them himself. Neighbors said he rarely spoke above a murmur. He would walk the same narrow path each evening, hand behind his back, eyes distant as if pacing the border of an invisible land. Ilona would wait at the doorway with a lamp. Some nights they shared bread, and she would read aloud from a book of psalms. He listened, though no one could say whether he believed. Perhaps belief was less important than the sound of her voice, low and unhurried, like the river beyond their wall. And for a while, it seemed that life had gentled him. He smiled, once, when a stray cat climbed onto his lap and refused to leave. He fixed a broken fence with his own hands. He gave a coin to a beggar without turning his face away. But the world outside did not forget his name. News of unrest in Wallachia drifted north, new princes, shifting borders, Ottoman pressure rising again. His name, whispered in markets, began to sound less like a curse and more like a possibility. In 1476, a messenger came. Radu, his brother and rival, was dead. The throne was open. Matthias, who had once bound him, now loosened the chain. A small army was gathered. Hungarians, Transylvanians, Moldavians, all drawn by the same strange magnetism of his name. He left at dawn, without farewell speeches. Ilona helped him buckle his sword, then stood by the door, the morning light soft on her face. "Come back if you can," she said. "If not, I will still keep the lamp." He nodded, unable to find words. Outside, frost lay thin on the fields, glittering faintly like old armor. The campaign that followed was brief, more echo than storm. When Vlad reached Wallachia, his enemies had already fled. The people, weary and uncertain, opened their gates. For a moment, he stood again in Targovishte, among walls that remembered him. The air smelled of damp stone and smoke long settled. He was king once more, but the world no longer bowed easily. His army, scattered and small, could not hold the borders. Within months, the Ottomans returned, swift and sure as tide. There are few clear records after that. Some say he died in battle, others that he vanished into the mountains. A few claimed his head was sent to Constantinople in a jar of honey, proof of death, gift of triumph. But certainty was never the shape of his life. Perhaps the truth is simpler. Perhaps he rode out one misted morning, armor dull, cloak torn, and was lost in the folds of the land that had both loved and feared him. In Pest, Ilona kept the lamp burning by the window through the winter. Each night, its small flame trembled in the glass, like a heartbeat waiting for a body. History ends his story there quietly, without judgment. And if one listens closely, that quiet sounds almost like mercy. The end, when it came, was quiet, not the storm that men expected from a life like his. It arrived beneath a grey sky, somewhere near the edge of a forest, when the snow had just begun to fall. There were no banners left to follow, no horns, no witnesses, only the wind, moving softly through the trees, and the dull rhythm of hooves in mud. Vlad had returned to fight once more, a last effort to hold the land that had already slipped from his grasp. His army was small, his allies uncertain, his strength thinned by years and ghosts. Yet he rode anyway, not for victory, but for recognition, a final act of presence in a world that was forgetting him. The clash itself is hardly remembered. A skirmish, a confusion of loyalists and enemies, perhaps even betrayal in the ranks. Some said he was struck from behind, others that he fell facing his foes. Both might be true. History, like winter light, does not stay long enough to be sure. When the fighting ended, the field was silent. Snow covered the bodies before anyone counted them. Among them, someone found a figure in battered armor, face still set in that same stern calm that had once frightened kings. His head was taken as proof, as symbol, as the closing punctuation of a name that had stirred too much air. They say it was carried to Constantinople, preserved in honey, and shown to the Sultan. A gift of triumph, a gesture of order restored. But perhaps, as it sat there in the foreign light of another court, even his enemies felt something quieter than victory, the strange sadness that follows the end of a familiar shadow. So ended Vlad of Wallachia, who had ruled by fear and by flame, who had written his will upon the land with iron and belief. To some, he remained the monster whispered about by travelers, the Impaler, the cruel prince, the name to frighten children into obedience. To others, he was the defender who stood against an empire when few dared to stand at all, a man who gave shape to resistance in a time of conquest. Both visions were true, and neither complete. What remains of a man when the noise fades? Perhaps only what the land remembers: the outlines of roads he built, the ruins of towers he once guarded, the soil that still bears his mark in secret ways. Centuries passed. The forests grew back. The stakes rotted into the earth. The castles turned to moss and quiet. And yet, his name did not vanish. It drifted into stories, then into fables, then into the half-dream of legend. Bram Stoker would one day borrow it, Dracula, and set it loose in another century, another kind of night. But the name that once made soldiers tremble was never meant for horror. It was born of lineage, Dracula, the son of the dragon. It carried both faith and fire, both oath and burden. Time, which erases wounds, also softens blades. The deeds that once burned bright with cruelty now glow faintly with mystery. And in that dimness, something gentle survives, a reminder that even the fiercest stories, when told slowly enough, can become quiet again. Imagine, then, the land as it stands now. The Carpathians blue with distance, the rivers flowing as they always have, the ruins of Targovishte under the patient stars. Somewhere, a traveler walks the same road he once rode, unaware that his footsteps echo the past. If you listen closely, you might still hear the sound of armor brushing against snow, or the soft creak of a door in a fortress long collapsed. But more likely, you'll hear nothing at all, only the deep breathing of a world that has forgiven what it could not understand. Vlad's story ends not in terror, but in transformation. He becomes what all lives become when enough nights have passed. A shape in history, a name in a book, a whisper told beside a fire, and, finally, a lullaby in the dark. So let the noise rest. Let the blade sleep beneath the soil. Let the river wash over the places where he once stood. Because the truest mercy of time is not to forget, but to remember gently. And now, the story quiets. The names, the empires, the fires all fade into the hush of time. What remains is only breath and the soft turning of the world beneath it. You don't need to remember the dates or the faces, just the feeling that even the loudest lives become gentle in the end. Let that thought rest with you tonight. If your eyes are heavy, let them close. The music will stay for a while, carrying you softly through what's left of the night. You are safe. The story is over. Now, only calm remains. Good night.